afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's press conference on the opening day of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, Ambassador Alexander Kmnett, President of the conference, and Beatrice Fihn, the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I'd like to ask the Ambassador to say a few words first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here. I think we've just concluded the morning session in the high-level segment. I think it's we're off to a very good start. There's a great sense of excitement in the room. We had many statements so far already. There's a buzz with great presence from civil society, of course, which is extremely important and very exciting. What we have seen in the process preparing for this meeting is a really very strong sense from the states parties about some key messages that they want to send about this treaty. And the first and most important one is that we are very serious about this treaty. We are very serious about the threat of nuclear weapons, and we are serious about that we think this is an important treaty which we will implement with all the commitment and seriousness necessary. The second clear message that states parties have said, and that was also partly the reason for the humanitarian conference hosted by the government of Austria yesterday, is this very strong concern about the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons, which is the basis of the TPNW. The treaty rests on this, and of course it couldn't be more timely than right now. So that we want to re-emphasize this aspect, and that's really what brings us all together, states parties, signatory states, and of course our colleagues and friends from civil society, is this shared concern. The third key message that we have heard over and over is one of openness, that we have. We know, of course, that there is a lot of contestation around the nuclear weapons issue, and there are also some, let's put it that way, false narrative about the TPNW. But we are undeterred about this, and we are going to follow through with the seriousness that I mentioned before. But we are open for engagement, not only to outside expertise, academia and civil society, to bring in more voices into the nuclear weapons debate, but specifically also to those who are yet to be convinced about the treaty. We think this conversation about humanitarian consequences and risk is absolutely crucial and essential, and we are the ones open, and we are creating the space in the international agenda to have this really profound discourse. And maybe the last one, the last key message is one of how this treaty fits seamlessly into the existing multilateral treaty regime on nuclear weapons, in particular, of course, the NPT, but also the CTBT and all the rest of it. So these are the messages that states parties will want to send, and one of strong commitment of taking the work on this treaty forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we can hear from ICAN, Beatrice Fihn.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you. The situation in the world is really dangerous right now, really challenging, and the risk of nuclear weapons use has increased these last few months because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine under these threats, explicit threats to use nuclear weapons. So this conversation in here about what the consequences of any nuclear weapons use would be is no longer abstract. It's very concrete, and there are people around the world who are very worried and thinking about the need to actually know what would happen if nuclear weapons would be used. So there's a real danger right now in the international community that we're entering a very challenging era where we could see more nuclear weapons, we could see more threats to use nuclear weapons, proliferation of nuclear weapons in new states, for example, and an undermining and lack of confidence in international law and multilateralism. I think that's why this meeting here is so incredibly important, because it really is a stark reminder that there are still many, many governments that refuse to buy into that narrative and refuse to let the world go in that direction. So many states have come together. The states parties, we keep on growing. Just yesterday, we were 3 new states ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Under these very challenging circumstances in the world, where many, many smaller nations are looking very worryingly at Ukraine and wondering what this means for their security, the fact that these countries are still ratifying this treaty is extremely important and should not be underestimated. And we're also seeing a lot of signatures, countries that have signed the treaty or are working towards signatures that are also working on ratifications, and will continue to ratify this treaty and grow the membership over the months to come. And I very much think that this meeting will re-energize that work. And we are also seeing countries that rely on nuclear weapons for this in the security doctrines, NATO countries, nuclear umbrella countries, that are participating in this meeting because they know that the current risks are unacceptable. And they know that the humanitarian framing is extremely important to reduce the risks. Right now, I think we've seen the intentional lowering of the threshold of use of nuclear weapons from Russia, with also propaganda about potential use of nuclear weapons and this kind of idea that we could normalize the threats to use nuclear weapons, that that's normal behavior. And if we are not very careful in the international community, that could be the new way nuclear armed states behave. So the fact that this meeting, and whether or not the countries in this meeting have signed or ratified or are just observing, makes an extremely important contribution to raising that threshold and making sure that we stigmatize these threats to use. So we were very pleased to see also strong condemnation from some states here today about the Russian threats to use nuclear weapons, which is very important that we do now as a collective world. And for those countries that chose not to attend, we are very sorry to see that they will not be part of this conversation to help prevent the use of nuclear weapons. But this conference here is going to make a solid contribution to stigmatizing the threats to use and put more political pressure on the nuclear armed states to not further deteriorate the international sort of security situation right now. So I think I'll stop it there.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fihn. Now we have time for some questions. Please state your name and the name of your media organisation. Yes, please, the lady in the middle. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Shoko Koyama from NHK. Thank you for organizing this briefing. Just two questions. I think the number of requests of observer countries was supposed to be 27 or 9, but I see lots of observer countries attending. How many of them are actually attending today? And the second question is just to double check. What can they do, the observer status? They can take the floor, but can they can't join the decision in the process of decision making, I think. Can you please clarify? Thank you.
I actually don't. Is it on? Yeah. I actually don't know the exact number of observer states. Maybe you can check that and I can get back to you. But I just want to say that states can participate as states parties or as signatories, and everybody else is an observer. So that includes countries that have supported the TPNW, and it also includes countries that are still skeptical about the TPNW. So there is not a special category of observers. It is simply those states that are here who have neither ratified or signed. They all are observers. And in terms of rights of observers, the rules of procedure that we have adopted are very not only open and progressive towards civil society, but they are also very open and inviting towards observers. So they have, of course, the right to speak. They can also distribute documents if they wish, and of course take the floor constructively in the debate. The only thing they cannot do is take part in the decision-making, obviously, which is only for states parties.
Okay, thank you. Further questions, please? Oh, yes, the lady in... Just a moment. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you.
sir.
Kana from Hiroshima. The Japanese government that doesn't attend today's meeting. And Mr. President, what do you think about Japanese government's absence?
Well, obviously, it's the sovereign decision of every state whether or not to participate. I can only say that from the side of the TPNW, we have done nothing but send out signs of being open and welcoming. So there are very important issues that are being discussed here. As Beatrice said, this is a treaty of states that are investing into international law and into the multilateral system. And that system is in a really difficult spot at the moment, very dangerous. So in my view, it is regrettable that states decide to not engage into this treaty. We understand that some states are not yet ready to join, but states that are supportive of nuclear disarmament should really be in a multilateral gathering that talks about nuclear weapons.
Can I just add, I know you asked the President, but I just wanted to convey from the Hibakusha, from the Japanese NGOs and the Japanese people and all the activists that are part of ICAN from Japan that they are very disappointed that the government is not here and urge them to reconsider. It is not too late until the meeting closes to show up. And we would really urge the Japanese government to just come and listen. There is very little expectation of doing. You are not committing to anything by attending this meeting. You just show up to listen to the stories of survivors, to the other governments that are very concerned about the threats to use nuclear weapons at the moment, and the member states of the TPNW. And I think that Japan should show up.
Okay, Ambassador, please.
Just to come back on the question of number of observers, the latest number we have is 33 observers and several more trying to still register.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, please, here at the front.
My name is Stefan Wospanik from the Austrian Press Agency. I've got a question concerning the decisions that are going to be made here in this conference. There's been talk about that there would be some kind of institutional structure. Could you tell us more about this? Will there be a Secretary General? Will there be an organization that verifies if a state wants to get rid of the nuclear weapons, and where will it work? Will it be with the IAEA? Are there any decisions already in the making?
That's a complicated question that will take a little bit of time to answer. The treaty foresees the designation of a competent authority or authorities to verify the elimination of nuclear weapons. However, this is something that will, of course, become relevant if and when a nuclear armed state joins. And we are aware of the fact that that's not immediately happening. The TPNW is a framework treaty for nuclear disarmament. It provides these pathways for when nuclear armed states are ready to join. So we are taking a decision now to prepare this decision on the designation. So what we are going to work on in the period after the first meeting of states parties is a very detailed and comprehensive discussion on what such an authority would have to be able to do, what its mandate could be, what is out there in already existing expertise in international organizations, in the civil society sector, to prepare states parties to take this decision whenever the time is ripe for it. So we don't want to rush this. This is, of course, extremely important, very technical. We want this to be well prepared. But there are other institutional aspects, and there we are also, I think, which is characterizing the entire work. We are innovative and flexible. We are setting up, subject to states parties actually taking the decision in 2 days, but what we have prepared is an intersessional structure that is extremely light-footed, that is setting up informal working groups on the various aspects of the treaty, where those states, together with ICAN, together with the ICSC and other stakeholders who are most active in driving some of the implementation aspects forward, will work together at a very low cost, at a very flexible way, bringing in the experience of the last 2.5 years of working virtually. So we are setting up something that is quite innovative in that sense, to help us implement the treaty in the most flexible and most inclusive way. So there's no secretariat planned at the moment. It is a process that will be driven by states parties together with our partners, but in a very flexible way to drive implementation forward. I hope that's clear enough.
So the next meeting will be in 1 year in New York. In the meantime,
the dates for the next meeting of states parties are still to be decided, but what we are setting up is exactly this intersessional work. So it's not that there is a meeting of states parties and then nothing happens for a year or two. It's what are we going to do in between? And that is, of course, the important thing. It's not just a meeting where statements are given. It's actually the work of implementation in between that's important. I don't know, Beatrice, if you want to add something?
Okay, and next question from the gentleman at the front. Oh, okay, sorry, we'll come back to you. The gentleman in the middle.
Klaus Bompers, Neue Westfälische. I wonder, President Kmnett, why you are so optimistic. If you look at this conference, we see that governments of 4 billion people of the world are not represented here. And we learned from the accession of China to the World Trade Organization, to the World Health Organization, and in the end, by Russia's action against Ukraine, both big countries don't play to the rules which are fixed in the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, and other treaties. So why should this treaty change anything in the thinking of the United States, China, and Russia?
Thanks. I don't know if you're trying to make an argument against international law, because I think...
It's obvious that there is a big argument because a lot of people don't follow it.
Yes, but that exactly is the reason why it's so important, isn't it? I would say it's...
How should it work?
What's the alternative? May I just throw it back? Yeah? Exactly. So states have either... Who was it who spoke yesterday about right versus might? Yeah? So the only thing that stops us from sliding into anarchy is international law. So it's setting norms. It's setting norms based on profound arguments. Yeah? It is regrettable that there are states that are not sticking to the rule. But would you say that we shouldn't outlaw murder because murder takes place? I think that's not the right way to go. We need these norms, and we need to strengthen these norms, and we need to build on these norms, precisely because there are actors that are not sticking to it. That is the whole purpose of international law, and specifically for smaller countries. And yes, of course, the TPNW is comprised of a lot of smaller countries. That is what helps and protects them ultimately. That is a solid security policy, is investing into international law and strengthening of multilateral norms. So I think the point that you're making is one of despair in many ways, yeah? that there are norm breakers, which is absolutely true. But I think the opposite conclusion needs to be drawn is exactly investing into strengthening these norms. And why I'm optimistic, because call me naive, but I believe in the possibility of change based on solid arguments. I believe in the discourse. I believe in the possibility of enacting political change based on strong arguments, and the TPNW, with its extremely profound arguments on humanitarian consequences and risks, and what does it mean for the conclusion of international security, is an extremely powerful set of arguments. And yes, we are only starting, and yes, this treaty is new, and yes, the membership is not that great yet, but it's the strength of the argument that makes me optimistic, and that's actually a sense of optimism that's shared across the room there.
And I just want to add a little bit to that because, of course, it's easy to be very demoralized about international law right now. But I also think that the incredible outrage, the global outrage and against Russia's nuclear threats, against Russia's invasions and violations of international law, massive sanctions, huge demonstrations all over the world, and a solidarity with Ukrainian people that's really remarkable, I would say. That has taken place because they violated international law. And I think this is incredibly important to remember that without these treaties, we don't even have anything to say that it's wrong. And I think without that, what are we as an international world? And I would also remind that we actually have countries on board, pretty big countries on this treaty as well. It's easy to talk about small countries. But we have 5 of the 10 biggest, most populous countries that have either signed and ratified this treaty. And these are also the countries that their populations are growing, and they are the future regional and global powers. We see populations in Western world decline and very much increasing in other parts of the world. And the world will not look the same in 20, 30, 50 years. And the fact that these countries with regional and global aspirations of being very influential players are not seeing that they will be the new P5 in the future with nuclear weapons. They will be nuclear weapons free in that role. And I think that's a very important thing. And I think another point is that, of course, we can see the 5 nuclear armed states of the NPT going in the wrong direction. We see countries like Belarus going in the wrong direction. We see other countries. But the fact that these other countries in the TPNW are choosing to still believe is very important, because we cannot take the lack of proliferation beyond the current 9 nuclear weapon states for granted. And it's very important what message we send to the world, to other governments, what they should have faith and trust in. So the fact that this treaty is happening is an incredibly strong signal that there are so many governments that still believe in international law as the way to protect themselves. And we see how these treaties work, even without all countries on board. We've seen so much evidence from the Bioweapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention, Landmines and Cluster Munitions Conventions, that it really drives change, normative change, that it changes behavior in countries that have not even participated in those negotiations, and that they are being held accountable for war crimes that they violated against international law. So I do think that this treaty will make a huge difference. And we are already seeing some of the responses from the nuclear armed states that this treaty will undermine our nuclear weapons. Yeah, that's the point of it. And I think that when the nuclear weapon states recognize that this treaty will have influence, I think we should all be proud and say, yeah, it will have influence.
But just to add to that, one argument that both states parties and civil society are often confronted is that, well, what's the worth of a treaty where the countries that have these weapons are not party to it? I always answer to that, the tremendous transformational potential of this treaty is really underscored by the fact that the states that have these nuclear weapons are so opposed to it. Because if it would be irrelevant, then they would simply ignore it. I think it is the power of the ideas on which the treaty is based, which is the strength, and I think which is the reason for the optimism behind the treaty that we see very much in this conference.
Thank you. We have a question at the front here.
Thank you. Fabian Sommervilla from the Austrian daily Der Standard. Really goes to both of you a question: how important is the outcome of the Ukraine war for the future of the TPNW? Because you could argue if Russia were to win, that nuclear weapons somehow shielded the win, and if Russia were to lose without ever using the weapons they have, it would be a strong argument that nuclear weapons won't ever be used by countries because it's just the norm. We don't do that anymore.
Shall I start? Yeah. I think the first answer is that whatever happens and what has already happened will have very profound impact on the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. We don't know which one, because it can go in many, many different ways. First of all, we have extremely high nuclear risk, so let's not forget that things can go catastrophically wrong, which of course we all hope is not going to be the case. But if it doesn't lead to that catastrophic, then it's really the crossroads point. It's the question whether what we have seen will lead to the conclusion that more nuclear weapons are needed. And we see, certainly in Europe, there is some discussion about that. But we have to think that through. What does this actually mean? First of all, if the conclusion drawn from that is a call for more nuclear weapons, this is a call for the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because how are we going to convince Iran or other countries who also are in precarious security environments? And if the drive for proliferation, if you think this through, is this the end point of that? Is that a safer world? Yes or no? I think, at least from our perspective, the answer is clear, it's not. Or we take the other way, which is where the treaty and the community here is trying to throw its weight in, is to use what we have seen to create a jolt in the international community that we need, that we cannot continue down this first track, that we have to try to enact change. So it's a really, really important moment. And this is why the discussion and the arguments that are being put forward against the arguments of those who put forward the logic of mass destruction is so extremely vital.
Yeah, I mean, just want to start also, like, nobody wins war, really, and in particular not these days. We've seen 20 years in Afghanistan, ongoing conflict in so many places, Syria. I can't see that anyone will win this war, and in particular not the Ukrainian people. And I think it also highlights that this conflict would have probably looked very, very different if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons. And I think it's really worth thinking about that you know, how this conflict could have played out, how if they would be if they would have even invaded at all if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, and something that we need to think about, or what lessons we want to learn for the future. I think it's really important that we are not naive about the nuclear armed states and their intentions in the world, and that we don't just trust things like security guarantees or a promise from a government that we won't use our nuclear weapons. I think we're seeing right now what happens when things change, when times change, when leaders change, and how government, despite things like Budapest Memorandum and security guarantees to Ukraine, just change their mind. As long as nuclear weapons remain in the power of some of these countries, or these 9 countries, a current leader or a future leader can make a decision to just invade or end the world as we know it. And I think that it's also a new realization. It's like a very instinctive, emotional reaction by some leaders to feel like more nuclear weapons is security. And I can understand that. People are very scared. Governments in Europe are very scared right now. I can sort of empathize with that instinct. But rationally, we will never be safe in Europe as long as Russia has nuclear weapons. Ukraine will never be safe from Russia as long as it has nuclear weapons. The world will never be safe as long as any country has nuclear weapons, because this can happen in other countries. And how we react to this situation will also shape how other nuclear armed states will calculate their decisions about threatening to use nuclear weapons in the future. So if we are not happy with this situation right now, if we don't think that Russia's nuclear weapons threats are legitimate and okay, then we should really do something about nuclear weapons. And that's what the governments here are doing. I think it's worth, even the very dire circumstances, it's worth to actually emphasize how important and significant it is that there are governments that still willing to do this under these circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Let's just see, is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question, or we'll come back to you for a follow-up. Okay, please.
Following your arguments, how would the probable failure of reconstructing JCPOA influence both this conference and the conference in August in New York?
Well, this conference will be over by the time it's still ongoing. Everybody in this room is a strong supporter of the JCPOA. It's more the impact is more direct on the NPT, I would say. The review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in August, because that treaty is challenged on a lot of fronts. It's not only, of course, the lack of implementation on nuclear disarmament, but it's also the core non-proliferation provisions that are challenged, because, of course, we all know that non-proliferation ultimately depends on progress on nuclear disarmament as well. So the fact that the fate of the JCPOA is unclear is a very negative burden for the NPT. Rather, let's put it that way, in a different way. If the JCPOA would have been reconstituted by the time of the NPT REFCON, there would have been at least some very tangible positive development. Since this, at the moment, unfortunately looks unlikely, the prospect for the NPT review conference on all fronts are very, very difficult.
And just to add, just want to remind people that this was Donald Trump who sabotaged this deal that was working. And it again shows how vulnerable we are to individual presidents and their whims. And when you break something, it can take decades to try to fix it. And again, why we cannot have this extremely vulnerable system of relying on the good judgment of these presidents and prime ministers. I think we're seeing the world survival we put in the hands of people like Trump and Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un, and just hope that they will do the best things when we know that that's not what they're going to do. And again, shows how there has to be a multilateral international law basis, and that the only thing that's going to guarantee that someone of these people don't do something stupid, again, is that we eliminate these weapons.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions, or shall we? I think it might be time to wrap up now, and unless you have any closing remarks, I'd like to.
Thank you for your interest, and please keep being interested. I think that's important. Thank you.
And also, we have a lot of survivors here who are also really the real experts on nuclear weapons. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to talk to the people who have actually knows the realities of these weapons more than anyone else.